2018. She provides preservation information and outreach, including assessments, consultations, training programs, and disaster assistance. She also represents NEDCC on the Coordinated Statewide Emergency Preparedness in Massachusetts Executive Committee. She's a certified archivist and has nearly 10 years of experience in public libraries, having previously held positions at the Denver Public Library.
Thanks, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, and I do know my title is quite long because the name of our company is quite long. Before I get started with my presentation, though, I know that Beth Lander earlier brought up D-Plan, and I don't want to just ignore that. So I want to say we are also really excited for our upcoming updates to how that's going to be. We're working on it, and I do also want to say that the new version is going to be even more comprehensive than our current version, and it's actually going to include some functionality for performing arts organizations as well. But in the meantime, you can absolutely start using the current D-Plan, and all of your information will transfer over. So just wanted to say that before I get started. So today's presentation is about a case study on moving collections preemptively to prepare for a disaster and using the experience to test a disaster response plan. So in our time today, I'll talk about the preemptive collections move in our case study. My NEDCC colleague Stephanie and I facilitated a test of a Boston area museum's disaster response plan to move collections preemptively, like when a weather event such as a hurricane is predicted. First, I'll explain how we set up the practice run and then how we evaluated it. Then I'll discuss our findings in terms of the lessons we learned by doing that practice run. These lessons were documented and used to improve disaster response planning in a very practicable way. And I think that any organization can use disaster plan testing to improve emergency preparedness. So I'll go over some ways to stress test the disaster plans at your own organizations as well at the end of the presentation. So the case study we're talking about today began when that Boston area museum reached out to us at NEDCC to ask about organizing and facilitating a workshop on preemptively moving their collections. And of course, we jumped at the opportunity to do some hands-on learning with them. We love that sort of thing. Not only would the program test their disaster plan, having us there as a third party would also help ensure that lots of questions are asked and the lessons that were learned would be integrated into the disaster plan afterwards. We began the day with a presentation on moving collections, followed by that practice run, and then we concluded the day with a review of what took place. So I want to talk a little bit about how that practice run itself went along. So we started at kind of at the preview. We wanted to review the current disaster plan and make sure that we were following it. We also had to, we wanted to walk through the building. Stephanie and I hadn't been there before, so we wanted to really know where we were going. And also all the participants, we wanted to make sure they knew the routes for moving collections as well. And then we did the collections move, and then we followed up with that review and did some activity and discussion there. The museum's disaster plan was very good, very thorough, and we were sure to take a close look at it before starting in on that practice run. The purpose of their disaster plan, of course, to prepare for both natural and human disasters. The best way to prepare for an emergency is to create a safe working environment and remove potential dangers before going in to start the recovery process. And by planning and training for emergencies, the risk of damage to life and collections is, of course, greatly reduced. In the event of emergency, the museum is to follow these 4 basic instructions here on the slide. Of course, the most important part of any emergency is to first protect human life. And then when safety is ensured and the area is secure, a response team can begin salvaging or preemptively protecting the collections. This plan, along with ongoing updates and training, allows staff to respond safely and effectively to disasters that may occur at the museum. Then we took a very close look at the final section of the museum's plan, which was salvaging the collections, and that included instructions on preemptively moving priority items within the collections. This section listed an order of operations and detail, starting with a broad prioritization. This, of course, is excellent practice as it offers a starting point, and it really faces the fact that not everything can be handled immediately and simultaneously. It also takes into consideration the physical arrangement of the collections in this particular museum. They recognize that the first area to flood in a water event, like a heavy storm or certainly a hurricane, is the first floor of their building 1. So collections kept there are the highest priority for moving up to higher, safer ground. Now, it'll be helpful for this audience to understand that this particular museum is located right on the Boston Harbor, and the buildings are quite old and somewhat difficult to maintain. They just simply aren't as resilient to weather events as modern structures that are built away from the ocean. And then there were instructions for moving the collections themselves, and these to-do lists were specific to each staff member and role, and sometimes really specified by name of a specific individual. As the consultants and facilitators for this project, we took a close read of the plan and displayed it like you see it here on the slide for staff to refer to during our practice run preview. And don't worry about reading all of it, it's just for reference. You kind of see where we were starting with this whole thing. And I also created personal to-do lists for each participant for the workshop, all the staff members there, taken directly from the original disaster plan, and distilled them into individual handouts for them to use during the practice run. So for those who would participate but were not assigned specific tasks by name in the original disaster plan, there is a general set of tasks to complete, and that's what we're seeing here on the slide. Again, don't worry about reading all of them. It's just to give you an idea of what we're doing. For the purposes of the practice run, the handouts also included a reminder for everyone to note down any issues they experienced during the test, any missing information they needed, barriers to completing tasks, additional tools and supplies that they needed, how difficult it was to move from one space to another, all of those kinds of things. So as you might imagine, the original disaster plan as a whole was very well thought out and as thorough as possible. So it's time for us to put it to the test. And then after practicing moving collections for about an hour, we concluded the test run and discussed our experiences over lunch. So we ran around the table and each participant talked about what went well and what could be better, and importantly, what information and tools they needed to make it better. The casual, low-stakes environment helped everyone identify their needs and some gaps, and it fostered a great discussion on how to address those needs and ultimately improve the disaster response plan. Stephanie and I served as the note takers for this discussion, and we chimed in on some brainstorming and offered some advice as well. So afterwards, we consolidated and categorized our notes to deliver to the museum as lessons learned. The idea is for the museum to be able to easily incorporate these lessons into their disaster planning based on their firsthand experience with that collections move. Of course, many of the lessons we learned during this workshop may apply to your own organizations and your own disaster planning. That's my hope. I mentioned that we categorized our notes, and I'd like to take you through all those categories as considerations for each of us when you're drafting or revising our own disaster plans. So moving collections safely is very time consuming, and the decision to move collections to protect them from an oncoming event must be made as early on as is possible. The total time for our practice here was much longer than we originally expected. And perhaps it would have taken up to a full day or even more to move the priority collections in actuality, if you're trying to get all of those priorities moved or to prepare for something like a hurricane. The timing is also affected by the number of staff members that are available to help for that situation. And those involved must be cautious of exhaustion, especially near the end of the day. They wanted to be sure to take breaks, try to move heavier, oversized, or otherwise difficult items at the beginning of the day while they still had a little bit more energy. Pacing the move is also important and must be communicated to everyone who's involved so they can keep along with the same pace. And we also want to make a note in their disaster plan to really continue to check in with the progression of the potential disaster itself. An event that's triggering an actual move is likely to be, of course, unpredictable and could change during the time it takes to move collection. So just a reminder to make sure that they're paying attention to the news and keeping up to date on what's happening. All right, and then staffing, it was determined that at least 6 or 7 people would be needed for an efficient collections move, and of course, even more would be better. Up to 9 people would be best. Specific role assignment for a move would be valuable. There's all these different aspects, including deinstallation, transporting carts, checking off an inventory checklist, and keeping track of all that sort of thing, staffing all the different locations that were parts of the route and the move of the collections. They decided at our museum that ideally 3 people would work on deinstallation together, including a person to give direction and instruction to the other people who were able to help out with that part. Another 2 or 4 people would transport carts of items in pairs, so it would be an even number there, making sure that no one's really left alone to deal with the situation on their own. And of course, having one set is imperative. Having 2 sets would be even better, because then you can have a cycle kind of going on and trading off. And then another 2 people to staff the vault where they were storing the collections, to be able to coordinate the home locations and materials and ensure proper placement, and to be able to keep up with the incoming items that were being stored. A few non-collection staff were available during the workshop as well, and they participated in the practice run, which was great, and their input was extremely helpful. Their help would be absolutely necessary during a real event as well, so it was really good to have their input for this practice run. Non-collection staff requested additional training on handling items properly, as well as packing and wrapping items. Practice exercises as well would be really great for them, because it would be, they don't normally work with collections on a daily basis, so having some extra practice and some written instructions as well would be really helpful for them. And finally, collection staff would have to ensure that the roles for non-collection staff during disaster response, that non-collection staff were able to take care of what they needed to in their own departments before coming to help collection staff, because of course they have their own responsibilities for their own work. All right, and then here's a little bit more about the deinstallation part. It's a large part of this particular disaster response because it is at a museum with displayed collections. But libraries and archives are commonly tasked with exhibiting materials as well, so I think that it can really apply broadly. Deinstalling exhibits comes with some complications, as you might expect, and it can really get down into some nitty-gritty details. One of the first things they noted in our test run is that to make a clear note in the disaster response plan to turn off exhibit case alarms. It seems pretty obvious to anyone who's used to working with exhibits, but just a quick reminder in a chaotic situation to do something. The first thing that's most important is really nice to have right there in black and white on in their disaster plan. They also wanted to have make sure they had separate carts or a table or a workstation to hold screw kits, gloves, instructions, and all of those parts of the deinstallation process, rather than using a single cart for both transport and as a workstation, and keep that part of the workflow separate. They also realized they needed to decide where to place the bonnets covering cases after removal, and to note those locations in the plan and how to deal with that. Having 1 or 2 moving blankets on hand would also allow staff to place bonnets on the floor without causing unnecessary scratches or damage. The list of items to be moved for an emergency was a very important coordination aspect of the move. It functions as an essential tool, and like all tools, having good ones makes the job much easier. Our museum had a list of priority items for the move, but the practice run helped them understand what additional information would be good to include in this list. So for example, they needed to add home locations to the spreadsheet, and some objects that didn't have designated home storage locations at the time of the practice run. So they wanted to make sure that they were going to be assigned before an actual emergency arises, because it ended up being really important to have that information at hand. They also wanted to reorder that list to reflect moving priorities by floor and maybe difficulty, rather than alphabetically or by accession number, where they're just automatically sorted in their initial spreadsheet. This would make the move much more efficient and make sure that that energy was being spent efficiently as well. And furthermore, they wanted to clarify that some objects were just too large or too difficult to move preemptively and would just have to stay in place during an emergency. And just acknowledging that and being really honest and clear about your limitations was really important. And finally, physical copies of that priorities list should be made available at key access points throughout the museum, such as the front desk, also another copy in the storage area, just available in general so it's easy to access. However, once the items were moved into that safer storage area, there were some more discoveries and some caveats about that on that end. And more than one person was really needed to hang paintings and reach high racks and shelves, as well as keep track of incoming items while they were putting other things away. If a home storage location was unlisted or undetermined, the catalog to do some investigation was completely inaccessible without laptops in this museum's particular storage area. So mobile laptops for them in the collections workspaces would be important to implement for their particular situation. Supplies and preparation of the mobile workspaces and transport carts were particular considerations and needed a bit more documentation in the disaster response plan. And I've seen some notes or some questions in the Q&A box before about supplies list and things like that. So making those sorts of things and inventories in your disaster plan is really important. The museum decided that they might want to include some N95 rated face masks, especially in a potentially contaminated environment. I should mention that we did this workshop last fall, so it was pre-COVID, and people weren't thinking quite as much about personal protective equipment or PPE as often as we are right now. So they did have gloves listed in their plan, and they were ready to go, but they also noted that it would be really helpful in the moment to just label all the sizes on every box and bag of gloves that they had available, so they could just get them very easily and make sure that they weren't putting on the wrong size of glove while they're trying to hurry. They determined that ethafoam padding for carts and workstations was necessary, and they considered acquiring some flexible supports to improve object stability during transport. The plan could also include instructions to remove lanyards, name badges, any sort of large accessories, and also to tie hair back before handling materials. So while collection staff might be used to all of this sort of thing, other helpers may be less familiar with this protocol, so it's just nice to note it down and make sure everyone's on the same page. I do want to mention this image on the slide here. It's from the Field Museum web pages about preventative conservation. I chose it because it's such a good example of the supplies our case study determined would be really necessary to fully carry out their disaster response plan. Some really good options and ideas there. All right, and finally, other activities that support emergency preparedness were discovered, of course, and discussed in the course of the practice run. One of the main concerns was succession planning, so meaning to de-silo institutional knowledge by documenting information that's memorized, that was previously memorized, but just one or two staff members. And they also wanted to define positions and clarify roles as needed, maybe making sure that maybe more than one person mentioned by name has some similar tasks so that nothing was missed in case that person was unavailable at the time. They also felt that a facilities manager position would be extremely valuable for emergency preparedness and preventative maintenance work. And this really became apparent when they were testing their disaster response plan. The lack of having that position was really noticeable and really felt like they could have some better advocacy points for getting that position in the future. They could also update their plan to include up-to-date locations of water shutoff valves and other essential systems. And in the longer term, hopefully procure temporary barriers or flood walls that may help to prevent water from leaking through the entrances and to maybe make this whole preemptive collections move a little less dire in the moment. Particular to our museum, they needed to address some flooring changes as well. There were some thresholds between smooth and carpeted floors that made it difficult to safely navigate carts carrying fragile and delicate materials. They also thought about distilling their disaster response plan into one of those handy color-coded flip charts that could be kept at hand and easier to use. And also, usually they're laminated, so it's nice to have in a water event disaster. Okay, so while it's great that lessons were learned and discussed, it takes a little more support to turn those into that better planning that I'm talking about. So for all of us who have studied emergency planning, and also if you've been present for some of the earlier presentations today, this cycle here is likely to be very familiar to you. I often start out a presentation on emergency preparedness with this graphic. This one happens to be from Boston University. It's simply their version of the emergency management phases, and there are several other graphics and versions of this out there. I believe it was, whose presentation of that? It might have been Badri's, actually had a fifth category in there as well, which is a little bit what I'm getting at for in this slide. Anyway, I'm including this chart here at the end of my presentation because it's the idea of testing a response plan, evaluating the results of that testing, and making improvements to the plan based on evaluation are processes that really link the recovery and mitigation phases. Because we often think of the mitigation as the first part where you're going to enter the cycle and as the recovery as the end point. So that link there is very important, which Emily talked about in the beginning of today as well. One of the many great things about testing your disaster response plan ahead of time is the ability to go through the cycle and improve your planning without having to go through a real disaster. The tricky part of evaluation is implementing the improvements that are discovered during the process, really incorporating them into the mitigation phase of the next round. I also want to make a note about the line on after action review here. If you're unfamiliar, it's a somewhat formal way that the military and corporations evaluate projects and events and find ways to make improvements. It's more or less what we did in the review meeting. Perhaps it was not so formal in our situation, but it still was effective. An after action review answers 4 questions. The first one is, what were our intended results? What were our actual results? What caused our results, and what will we sustain or improve? So that's the basic functions of an after action review. Like any process improvement tool, after action review has its strengths and weaknesses. One of the best ways to ensure its effectiveness is to gather input from everyone involved and try to build accountability for implementing those improvements. The facilitation and support that we provided as outsiders allowed us to ask a lot of questions in this process and about details that might seem obvious to one staff member but not to others. We were able to take notes objectively and consolidate and categorize them into a single document and then offer that document to the museum a few days later so they can implement it easily. Our idea was to make the suggestions we had straightforward and the suggestions that they came up with themselves and be able to easily adopt them into their disaster response plan. The accountability for implementation comes from the experience that participants had firsthand during the practice run. Plus, having that firsthand knowledge of any gaps in the plan can really help them articulate their needs to each other and to administration. So it could really help with that advocacy piece as well. Okay, so hopefully this wealth of lessons that we learned has sparked interest in testing your own emergency preparedness planning. I highly encourage you to do that. And also note that your testing doesn't have to be a full-on practice run of moving your collections. It can be a variety of activities, and it can focus on just one aspect of your plan or many aspects. It's up to you. Just to give you a couple ideas, and you've heard them earlier today as well, tabletop exercises are a great way of doing this. You can make sure you're practicing your evacuation and shelter in place drills. You can do that risk assessment, which I'll talk a little bit about and that you heard about earlier today. And of course, you could do a practice move of a collection of your collections if you find that particularly appealing. It was pretty fun, I have to admit. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about risk assessment, and that's mainly a thought experiment and can get you really thinking about ways you can test your planning as well. So risk assessment involves a few things. In the process, we identify possible hazards, both natural and man-made. We identify the vulnerability of our collections and the impact that a disaster of a particular nature would have on them. For example, the state of our buildings is in constant fluctuation, the roof ages, drainage gets clogged, climate control equipment has to keep up with the changing weather patterns. Maybe the patterns of your building use have changed over time. You want to identify the hazard in the building, but also maybe in your neighborhood or your region. You want to assess how likely and what kind of damage or impact that a disaster would have, and then implement some mitigation measures. So a great way to organize and prepare the risks that you identified is by developing a risk assessment matrix. This is a very simple one. There are more complex ones that can be really, really helpful as well. But this one you could just jot down on a piece of paper as you're trying to organize your thoughts. So this will be based on both the probability of occurrence and the impact of your materials. High effect and high probability are the ones that you want to prepare for the most. In our case study, we're right on the ocean. We're here in New England, and weather events and the resulting flooding are immediate threats. But you also don't want to forget about the low probability and high impact risks. Though low in likelihood, the impact can be devastating. And as you can see, events like the pandemic flu are really thought of in this way. In any case, this is a quick tool to help you determine other potential threats that could trigger the use of various sections of your disaster plan. And then you want to try to hypothetically test your responses to each of those threats. All right, so understanding how to prepare for and respond to emergencies accomplishes a couple of things. First, you're well versed in your own disaster plan, so you'll feel confident and well armed with the tool that you understand and have practiced. Second, it exposes weaknesses in even the most comprehensive great disaster plans, like missing information or a policy that just doesn't quite work out in actuality, which is why the practice run in our case study was so helpful in improving an already good emergency response plan. This testing is also wonderful training for all staff. It builds muscle memory and is an opportunity for all stakeholders to provide input at an appropriate time where are really open to new ideas and improvements. All right, and that brings me to the end of my presentation. So I'll hand it over to the next presenter. In the meantime, feel free to reach out with any questions you have about this presentation or about preservation to my email address here on the slide. I'm happy to talk with any of you.